Next up, we're going to have a discussion of the Pioneering Space Summit that took place this past February in Washington, D.C., where 100 of the most influential members of the space community worked to break down barriers and open a dialogue between traditional and new space companies. Between the government and the private sector and across all verticals in the industry. One result of this summit was the Pioneering Space Declaration on spacedeclaration.org. Rick Tomlinson and Marilyn Dittmar, the organizers of the Pioneering Space Summit, will now discuss additional output and the next steps to move this initiative forward. Please welcome Marilyn Dittmar and Rick Tomlinson.
Welcome to the revolution. Damn. So, we've been asked to talk during Space National Summit in Washington, February 19th and 20th at the Reagan Center. This was a very interesting event and basically came about based on a conversation that happened between myself a year earlier and a person who was in charge of the SOS. And we started this conversation with, it was rather awkward at the very beginning. Those of you who know me understand why. I was, the call started with, hey, I was one of the guys that helped brand it the Senate launch system. And this was his pet project, and we started a conversation and said, you know what if we just didn't talk about that? And what if we started focusing on what it is we're all trying to do and where we're all trying to go? And what happened was, to use a little California speak, it helped create a clearing for a new conversation. By the end of the call, I was giggling. This fellow doesn't really giggle much, but he was kind of smiling. I could feel him through the phone. He was actually in Moscow, and I was in Texas having this conversation. I was like, you know what? Wouldn't it be funny if we were actually on the same side of something? Well, what's interesting about that kind of exercise, which is called getting off it, getting away from your positionality and looking at a new perspective from the people that you might have been dealing with from your position and starting to look at their position and seeing if there's a shared way of looking at things, is that things begin to shift. And that began to move into the direction of, well, what if we could do this with the community? We've all been fighting for so long over who's got the best rocket, who's got the best destination, who's, I've got this, screw you, that kind of thing. How do we get over that? How do we get to something that's useful and begin to find some commonality? So we started working on the idea of putting a group of people together in a space where they could talk, and be very frank and get right to the point of things and do it in a way that was creative and positive and unifying. So that was where we came up with the idea of the Pioneering Space National Summit. Now, originally this was going to, and since this is this crowd, we're going to do a little inside baseball talk here. This was originally going to be called the Space Settlement Summit. I was coached by some very wise people that when you're trying to sell somebody a car that they don't know they need to buy, you actually have to get them on the lot. Then you sell them the car. Well, there are a lot of people in Washington that at the beginning of this process were allergic to the word settlement. So we came up with the word pioneering, which is now acceptable as a phrase to get people to come to the event. And so in Washington, we moved forward with the event. Now here's the goal statement at the start of it. To agree upon a shared vision and set a basic national agenda for U.S. human space activities beyond low Earth orbit, leading to the permanent, thriving, and expanding human communities on the Moon, Mars, and free space, and to identify and prioritize the major areas of focus and knowledge needed to succeed in that goal. The event was presented by the New Worlds Institute, which is an organization that we've begun recently to focus on the destinations that'll be complementary to the work of the other activist groups and things like that. We will not be an activist group. We want you to do that job. We'll come back around to that at the end of this talk. The Heinlein Trust very generously helped kick in some funds, and SEDS, who was in early and gave us a lot of great volunteers. It was sponsored by the Heinlein Trust, XISP, Coalition for Space Exploration, more on that in a minute, Moon Express, Vivisat, and GHG, which those of you who may know Israel Galvan in Houston, that's his company. Participating organizations, and I may have left one or two off, I'm not sure. Space Frontier, AAS, AIAA, Explore Mars, Silicon Valley Space Center, and the National Space Society. So we brought in a big tent of people. Now, here's a very important point. This was 110 on the first day people, it was 100 or so the second day, who disagree on pretty well everything. I mean, there are people in this room who I can literally say hated each other at the beginning of this exercise. But these were top-level people. We had congressional staffers, current and former. We had aerospace executives, the vice presidents of, how much of it is? It's my ass, right? Your ass. All right. We had vice presidential level people from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, SAIC, Aerojet, ATK, et cetera. We had people who were advisors and will be participating in the Republican presidential campaign. We had people who were advisors and would be participating in the Democratic campaign. We had major leaders from space agencies and groups like that. We had people like Buzz Aldrin. We had other people who were from the commercial space arena, Jeff Grayson from X-Corps. And again, people who had championed, for example, Jeff Bingham, who had worked on the space station, things like that. Everybody in one room with one common goal, to see if we could have a new conversation. Now, I should back up for a second because I skipped this. Along the process, this wonderful lady shows up very early on, and frankly, there would have been no event at all. But Mary Lynn showed up and injected a life into it, and the fact is that we've been on opposite sides of things. And the credibility of this whole thing is like, hold it, if those people can talk, if those people can work together. And so the executive committee, for example, it was Jeff Bingham, who was one of the people that helped put together the space station, and Jeff Grayson, and Mark Craig from SAIC, and the two of us. And these people were all working together, and I can't say enough about how cool it was, because there was almost no disagreement on this committee. Everybody wanted to get to this common goal. So here are the ground rules. Everything discussed at the Pioneering Space Summit is private. No press. I'm sorry to my blogging friends in the back. And it was nothing personal, guys, although Keith Cowing thought it was. And I am now a member of the Illuminati, according to Keith Cowing. You saw the logo. We got a pyramid in there. But we had to create an opening. We had to create a place where people could talk freely. And people position themselves, and they talk to the camera, and they talk in a different way when the press is present. We started 100 miles up. That was a rule. No political issues. It's nonpartisan. And you can't talk about your favorite destination, Moon, Mars, or free space. Those were the main rules. Oh, and there was one other one. No launch vehicle discussions allowed. This sign, as those who were there will remember, was in the back of the room. No launch vehicle discussions. Those of you who are veterans of this field understand how important that is, that we did not argue about SLS versus Dragon versus this versus that. It was removed. And by God, everybody went with it. It was amazing. So then we spent 2 days, myriad numbers of votes on a potential declaration that we could all agree on. We started with a straw man, worked our way through that, and by the end of the second day, with a lot of workshops, and by the way, the voting was yes, neutral, no. If somebody disagreed or was neutral, we came to that person and we worked with them live in front of everybody. And then we went into workshop, then we would come back. And they would mop the blood off the floor in between, and then we would, go from there to the next one. This is the declaration that was put together, and this is the preceding and post text that goes with it, that was agreed on by the participants. It says that a diverse group of people, a group of over 100 space leaders from academia, government, and industry came together at the summit, setting aside previous debates and focusing on shared interests they achieved a consensus and forged the following statement. Every comma, every letter, every word on all of this was part of the consensus. The long-term goal of the human spaceflight and exploration program of the United States is to expand permanent human presence beyond low Earth orbit and to do so in a way that will enable human settlement and a thriving space economy. This would be best achieved through public-private partnerships and international collaboration. 100% consensus, 99.8. We had 99.8 people say yes, and one did neutral on the last day. All of these people agreed on this phrasing. Now, the idea of this event is to get it out, or is to have this conversation so that the people in the room can look at people that they have previously disagreed with and share an idea. And that's the core idea. Everything else that happened beyond the sharing of mind that occurred in that room is, as we say, gravy. But there is a lot more happening, and I'll let Mary Lynn talk a little bit about that. So we'll keep that up while we talk. And by the way, we're being casual on purpose about this. This is the last session or so of the day. Go ahead.
Oh, short people. So just a word about why I participated. I was asked to participate. But the other reason I participated was because there's, as you know, sitting in the room, there are a lot of different perspectives on how we get there. And over the years, those perspectives have fragmented the space community, and they have had a couple of results. One is that there is no such thing as a space community. There's a bunch of different factions that all say they belong to a space community, but since we never speak with one voice, it's been really difficult for us to get policymakers to take us seriously across the board. So you have policymakers who are also fragmented. And sooner or later, that starts to work against you. And since I'm a very strong advocate of it all across the board, even though at various times I take various policies, it seemed to me that it was really important for us to be able to see if we could come together with a common goal, because frankly, if we can't do that, then we're making the future we deserve. So that's why this was so important. What I want to say about what's happened since is I live in the policy environment, I work in the policy environment. Wednesday today referred to it as I live in Washington, miles surrounded by reality. That's pretty good. Logic-free zone is another way to refer to it. However, inside the logic-free zone, something's happened, I think, since the summit. And that is that whereas before the summit, the Act of 2010 has in its opening paragraph that one of the goals is to expand human presence into the solar system on a permanent basis. I don't recall exactly the language, even though I shaped this thing based on that language, so I should remember it. But basically, it's the notion, it's in the act, okay, that the goal of the act is to expand permanent human presence into the solar system. Prior to the Space Summit, that was almost never referred to. When the act was talked about in policy circles or talked about on the Hill, it always devolved to a discussion about heavy lift vehicles, crew vehicles, okay, allocations. Do we want this thing called commercial? End of the conversation. Since the summit, people actually now pay attention to that first couple of paragraphs in the NASA Authorization Act, which has been a really good thing. So now when you're up on the Hill talking to staffers, okay, it's to have the notion of permanent human presence discussed. And if for no other reason, the summit was worth it, just for that reason. The second reason is because I move across these fracture lines all the time, there are people who are continuing to talk to each other now who were not talking to each other before. And I spend a lot of time with what's referred to commonly as old space, okay, as well as time in new space. And one of the things that's very interesting is that on both sides now I hear people say things like, okay, who do we need to get in the room from that other camp? Prior to the Pioneering Space Summit, you never heard the question asked. So for that reason, the Pioneering Space Summit was really important. So the only other things I would sort of say about this is, like most human endeavors that have a very long time, and this one that we're all engaged in does, change is sometimes really incremental, But don't lose track of the fact that just because it's not visible on every blog, that doesn't necessarily mean that nothing is happening. Okay, things are happening, and they're beginning to impact the way people put meetings together. They're beginning to impact the way that people think about shaping policy. Even the nature of the arguments has toned down a little bit. Still have them all the time, okay? But no longer screaming at each other. At least it's come down a few decibels, okay? And that's all steps in the right direction. So I think that's really due to Rick and his vision, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. So anything I could do to help was great.
Oh, I'm sorry. So a couple of points to keep in mind here. Many, many years ago, one of the guys I'm a fan of, and I shouldn't say this because it'll go right to his head, but Charles Miller came up with a statement, and I remember the statement because it's echoed in my head forever, and he talked about changing the conversation, and that was the work of the Space Frontier Foundation. And again, that's what we were trying to do here, like directly, in a very strong, right to the core of it. Part of the reason this is important is because if you have a settlement-oriented program, if that's your goal, the subsidiary decisions you make below that shift. If you're going to settle Mars, for example, the difference is between taking a shovel that is extremely lightweight, collapses into a very small space, and is going to actually penetrate the regolith 2 or 3 times and then be left behind, or taking a shovel that is able to be collapsed, taking it to Mars, and is going to be able to be used for 10 years and replaceable with local materials. It's a different thinking path you go down. Now, I should also mention that on the first day, in the first hour or two, we laid out the terms. What does permanence mean? What is an outpost? What is a settlement? Those kinds of things. And it's very important, and everybody was pretty well on board with that. And so we were having a contextualized conversation. I will mention something else before Al does. We're including, okay, this means low Earth orbit. But the issue, Al, is when we're dealing with a lot of people like you and me, and Joe, and Mark, and you try to wordsmith something at that level, ask anybody who was in the room what that was like.
Me.
Okay.
Until 2 in the morning.
Yeah. We were going till 2 or 3 in the morning on this thing, trying to just commas and periods and things like that. So when you get into parsing things at a detail level, that's where we fall apart. So we had to move beyond that. You have to focus on the broader interpretive meaning of it and go for the one word. And that was our victory. It was the word and the conversation. Settlement. Now, recently, I have to tell you, afterwards, look, I'm the guy, those of you who know me, I'm the guy, man, I want to parts, I want to be cutting off body parts and raising the flag and the trumpets and that kind of thing. That's me. So I had to get off it myself, and I was actually upset after the summit. I was like, where's the change? And this guy here, Bruce Pittman, sat me down, and I was sitting in his office, and he said, Rick, did you, and this is a real old reference, so if you ever watch old movies, you'll know it, but he said, Rick, did you ever see the movie Force 10 from Navarone? I thought about it. I was like, yeah, okay, I remember that movie. This is a movie where they slip into Germany and they have to blow up this major dam. And they set the charges and they do the plunger. And the bomb goes off inside of the dam, but nothing happened. One of the guys looks over at the brainy guy and goes, well, nothing's happening. And then the brainy guy goes, just let nature take its course. And after a minute, the crack appears and the dam starts to break. That's the kind of change we're dealing with, as Marilyn was addressing. So it's happening slowly. And I had somebody email me something a few weeks ago, and there was a statement by one of the hardcore old guard in the Senate, Senator Nelson from Florida, where he was trying to get Bezos and Blue Origin to come down to Florida. And in the sentence, the last sentence of the letter, he used the word settlement twice. This is where we want you to leave from to go settle, and we want the settlers to fly out of Florida. And I was like, wow. Those of you who have been in this field for a while, that doesn't happen. So it's starting. So what we're asking you to do is to get involved and help us make it happen. I want to ask for a couple of comments from people who were there, but spacedeclaration.org. Now, there is no expiration date on the declaration. And we have two ways this can roll out from here. We can go for the mythical and unachievable million-person march on Washington approach, where we get a million people to sign the declaration, which isn't going to happen, folks. It just ain't going to happen. That's like saying, a million people in Europe are going to march into the court of Isabella or something and go, let's go to the New World. It's not going to happen, right? But what we could do is we could get 50 to 100 recognizable names and a lot of other people on board. So those who might be interested in, please talk to us, talk to some of our friends, SEDS and former people. Eric, you're sitting there, I'm pointing at you, and other people like this, and say, look, I know so-and-so, and I can get them to sign. And if we can get 50 or 100 names, then I'll go out, I promise, I'll go out and raise the money, and we'll go have another event in Washington and call in some very important people and point at this. And of course, we'll have the SEDS guys there, because they're awesome. And I do want to make a comment about SEDS. SEDS was amazing. We had eight SEDS students. And I have to tell you, it was kind of cool. They all dressed in black, and they stood at the back, and it was very cool. And they worked their tails off on this thing, and SEDS is amazing. And we had them there, A, because they work hard for free, grad students and things, slave labor, I'm sorry. And B, because this is for them. And I wanted people in the room to know it's all about what we're handing the next generation. So, without any further on that, I just want to ask a couple of people. Bruce, could you maybe share your thoughts? We've only paid him a little bit to, I don't know what he's going to say, so anyway. But I want to get a couple of comments from people who are here.
I just want to call out somebody else that was really important to doing this, without which there wouldn't have been a summit, and that's Megan Crawford.
Yay!
So Megan herded cats, meaning me, Rick, SED students, various people who got lost in the hallway, folks who were trying to figure out how to find their ways to the bathroom. She had an answer to absolutely everything, and the summit, when it took place in like 2 feet of ice and snow, and she sort of made sure that everybody got in and knew where they were going, and was just sort of this arch organizing woman. So thank you again for everything that you did.
And had the website up in 24 hours. Go ahead.
So it was truly, so it was truly a remarkable experience. I've been pushing this rock up this hill for a long time, like decades, as have many in the room. And you tend to get a little jaded after a while. Kind of like, I guess we should call that the Sisyphus complex. And you begin to wonder if change is really possible. But Rick and I had talked about this earlier, and actually it was at NewSpace last year. We were talking about this, and he was kind of wavering, was this a good idea? And several of us were encouraging him onward, that no, this really could be valuable, because in my background as a system engineer, I found a remarkable thing that this took advantage of. If instead of focusing on what you disagree on, if you raise the level of the conversation to the point where you find what you can agree on, and then agree to work on the other stuff, then amazing things can happen. And I had seen this happen once before. We did this exercise with a more, kind of monolithic group. Back in 2006, Shanna Dale, when she was deputy NASA administrator, had put together a workshop to say, what do we do with Constellation? And so this was a little bigger group. It was about 150 people. And they split us up into 7 groups. And we all worked independently. And this was astronauts, this was the ESA, this was industry. Tumlinson was there. We lowered our standards and let Rick in. And it was pretty amazing, because we came out with the same conclusion. Even the NASA stalwart guys, the long-term goal of human exploration was settlement. And that always stuck in my brain. That always kind of amazed me that one, we agreed, and 2, that these guys were willing to say it. because some of these guys are career civil servants, and some of us have no career aspirations whatsoever, so we weren't so worried about it. But some of these guys, and Wendell Mendel he's retired now, right? I can say this? Yeah. So Wendell Mendel went one step further, and he said, and if he said to NASA, if long-term settlement is your long-term goal, he said, you have the wrong architecture. Now, and so that always stuck in my mind. So, and we were kind of hoping that this was what we would come up with. We didn't cook the books and everything. I mean, honest to God, this was a consensus and everything. But it is important, because a lot of people were complaining that, we should have done more. It should have been more definitive. Why didn't you say this? Why didn't you say that? Why didn't you include my favorite thing? But I think, again, it's a nice core to build the future around. And I want to give the people that put so much time and effort into this another round of applause, because it was a tough thing to do, and they did it very well, and I think we all owe them a debt of gratitude. So, thank you.
Anyway. So, I wasn't looking, but thank you. The key point here is what we do going forward. The key point is not what we've done to get us to this point. The key point is what you do to carry this forward. Now, our little New Worlds Institute is, as I said, we are not an activist organization. This is it for us. We needed this ourselves to some degree so we could start focusing research and things like that, because we're going to be focused on that. Our job is the critical path. Our job is putting together the little pieces that'll help us get there. Your job is to carry this forward. Whatever space group you're a part of, I know most of you or many of you are Space Frontier Foundation members, and you should be if you're not. Your job is to forward. Figure out what you can do. Bring up the phrase. Make your local congressional staffer uncomfortable, right? Because in the area of uncomfort is the beginning of discovery of what is possible, or retreat. And either way, you're going to know where they stand, and now you can move them forward. So please get involved in it. Anything you can do to help us is going to be great. Anybody, in fact, go sign up. I challenge everybody in this room to sign up on the Declaration. And all it does is say, I've read this and I agree. There is power in declaration. That's the whole point of this. I declare, I believe that human settlement is the goal of the human race. And that is where I stand. And that's where we want you to stand too. All right? Thank you. Oh, do you guys want any Q&A real quick? Any questions? I knew there would be one.
Rick, I'm Doug King from the Museum of Flight up in Seattle, and this is incredibly inspiring to me. I said the other morning when I spoke for a minute that it's really hard to get across to an audience like this how difficult it is for the public to believe in your credibility. They're just not there yet, and yet we got 500,000 people a year walking through with their kids looking at our version of the future, trying to tell what you're doing. And my colleagues around the country, more people attend science museums around the country than go to NFL football games. And we've got a platform, and you've just given me something to go back and say to my colleagues, why don't we tell the public about this? Is it really crazy to get 1 million people to sign this thing? I mean, we're going to put it in our museum, so let's talk about it.
Thank you for shattering my myopia.
Thanks, Rick. This may be a bit of a tough question, but I felt like it might be the right forum to ask it. There has been a certain amount of criticism of the Pioneering Space, or the Space National Summit, in certain blogs and corners of the internet. And,
none of you guys.
The criticism has focused around the fact that, as far as I know, the names of the participants were not publicly available. And just that to increase credibility, having 50 famous people or 1 million less famous people sign it is good, but we really need the people who were at the summit to sign it publicly. And I think, honestly, if that isn't done, it will have no effect whatsoever. Thank you.
Two things. One is, I think it's already had an effect, so I disagree that it will have no effect. I would agree that it would be useful for that to happen, but let me just sort of step back again. What we were asking people to do is, there were people in the room who collectively represent, no kidding, billions of dollars, and who also represent 20 years in some cases of adherence to particular policy positions or viewpoints about how this should happen. There were people in the room who really truly couldn't stand the sight of each other. One of the more amazing conversations, and in fact couldn't be seen with each other in public because other people would have issues with it. I mean, it was just, so what we had to do was create this really safe space, and the problem was to try to find a way to do it that held numbers together that could be managed through a couple of days of really intense work, and also could allow people to let their hair down. They could talk well enough together that they might be able to get to some sort of consensus. So the price we paid for that was that people, by the end, were completely freaked out by what had happened, I think. I mean, there were people in the room that were just going, happening. I mean, truly, I don't know, Bruce, if you sort of, what you sort of said. I mean, really, people just were just, what did we just do? And the end of that result was that we ended up with people sort of saying, we're so unsure of what we just did, we're just not willing to talk about it yet. Now, my own view is we may be able to get to a point, I hope, sometime in the near future where we can go back to many of those people and say, how do you feel about it now? But we had to honor that decision. And so, is it satisfactory? No. Is it the best of all possible worlds? No. Could we maybe have done it better? Yeah, probably. Who knows? But that's how we got to where we got to, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, we've been talking for, I guess, 3 days about, having a market for something. Has anybody done a survey or a marketing study to figure out if there's a market for extraterrestrial settlements? I mean, I live in Mojave and nobody wants to live there. I live in a house that's above ground and not 20 feet under the ground because the heat's radiation's bad.
No, I remember talking to Grayson when he moved to Midland. He thought he was going uptown. You've never been to Midland, never mind.
I've been to Midland.
Okay, then you know what I mean.
No.
No, obviously, no survey. I don't know if I require one.
Okay.
Any more than, Columbus or any of these other people asked for permission. Now, will there be utilization if we're effective in what we're doing, if we can, based on our own spiritual belief, because this is a spiritual belief, I have no evidence, I have no empirical evidence that if we open space, life will be better. I have my belief. But if I can get to the other side of that, and my belief proves reality, then a survey won't be any problem. I think having a survey might be useful.
Okay.
And it's the second part of
I
the
mean-
statement, the thriving space economy.
That's right.
Yes.
We put that in there intentionally,
Right.
that to make the settlement, you need the thriving space economy. So it's the chicken and egg. Do you get the settlement when you get the economy, or do you get the economy when you get the settlement?
Right.
Well, I
But
mean,
they're linked together. You've got to find a way to make money in space, to make space settlement.
Right,
Right, but,
I know what you're
I
saying
mean-
on the survey, and I think it's important, but if the people who went on the Mayflower had gone to the local peasant in England and said, should we use the wood to build a boat, or do you need a better pen for your pigs? Nobody would have gone. So
Yeah.
I agree, it's useful to get data from the public,
And
but you
the
also
Nor-
have to move forward.
well, the North
We only
Ameri-
have one more with
the
Mark.
North American settlement thing, people are already living here, so I don't think
I know,
that's
and I promise
necessarily
not to hurt the
right.
Martians.
Yeah, I just had to disagree with my colleague Dale Scran, who was the person who asked the question just before the last question. And he said that, this wasn't being all that important unless some of the people that were there signed up on it. And I really strongly disagree with that. In fact, I think what you've been saying about it is underestimating its importance. I say that because I started pushing space settlement personally about 19, which was a few years ago. And when it was being pushed, everybody thought we were nuts. I mean, really nuts. I wouldn't put the fact I was involved in doing that on my resume, for example, because I wanted to be employed. And the difference between then and what came out of this summit, where all of these important people actually used the word settlement, which in some places is, up until this was something that you didn't talk about in public. That was enormous. And it made me feel really good to have gone from a period when everybody thought that I and my friends were crazy, having all these important people finally agreeing with what we were talking about for a long time. I thought that was important. Ideas are important. And when ideas get spread to ever increasingly more important people, then you know that you're winning. And I felt that as a consequence of this summit, there was a really strong confirmation of the fact that the things that most of the people in this room have long believed are we're winning, we're moving towards the actual fulfillment of these things, and I think this was a major step in that process.
The day that I get endorsed by Mark Hopkins, I'm a happy camper. Stand right now, but those of you who were at the summit, could you raise your hand, please? So see these people if you want to ask about what happened. Yeah, John's here. Thanks, man. All right. Thank you very much, folks. Good.
Thank you.
End of the road, guys. 3 days, an awful lot of good conversation. The most full room I've ever seen at the end of a space conference, and I include like symposium in that. So for being at the end, it's looking good. So when I began this, when I opened this conference 3 days ago, I talked a little bit about what the Space Frontier Foundation is and what it does. I talked about our goal for the space frontier to humanity as rapidly as possible. And you have a lot of context for what Rick was just describing and his event that's pushing towards that goal a little bit more on the political and some with the traditional industry side. You've seen a lot of small companies that were talking about what they were doing to work their little piece of it, but every one of them was talking about business. And as an organization, the way we see it is if you're not moving business ahead, you're not moving the industry. If you're not moving the industry, you're not moving humanity towards that goal. So, as I said when I opened this, there's a clear call to action. We laid it out, and the purpose of this event is executing it. And as we look over sort of the last 10 years, as I said, I helped run NewSpace 1. Here we are at NewSpace 10, and I can categorically say we are making progress. So for my part, I couldn't be more happy with this event, and I'm going to allow the last few words, pass the last few words here to our conference chair and the Space Frontier Foundation's new executive director, Hannah Kerner. But thank you so much, guys.
Thank you all so much for coming. Some of you may know I have only been with the new space industry a couple years. I came here from NASA. Actually, I spent 3 years with NASA. And I can tell you that the vision of humans living and working in space, the vision of the Space Frontier Foundation, will be achieved through the new space industry and the companies you've seen here today. I'm so thrilled to be able to lead this conference and lead this foundation to that vision. So thank you for coming and contributing to the vision. We'll have the pre-gala reception starting at 6:30 in the Cascade room where the exhibits previously were. And that'll go till 7:30 when we will transition to the Sierra room for the gala dinner with a keynote by Andy Weir, author of The Martian. I'll see y'all there.